here, you'll notice there's another one here. I'm going ahead and I've gone ahead and assigned string name to be null. Anyone know why it's surprising that there's no IntelliSense on this saying, hey, that's a problem? Anyone know why it should be a problem? It's not a trick question. Yes. Oh, great. This is great. We're gonna go. If Austin tell us what the reason for this is. Austin happens to be in a C# class. I won't mention any of the teachers, but I happen to know. I have inside knowledge. Austin.
Should be that right now nullable is disabled.
Yes. So it turns out that in C# 8, by default, a string type that is not decorated with a nullability operator is not null. It should not be null. And yet the compiler here is not warning, and you'll notice there's no warnings appearing at the bottom. So even though string is supposedly not null, and I'm assigning null, the compiler is saying no big deal. That's not a problem. It's totally okay. And it turns out that if Microsoft went and took all your existing code and changed all your reference types to by default be not null, that would break a lot of people's compilers. There were a lot of areas being showing up. Many of you are very disciplined and you've gone through and you said warnings. If a warning shows up, that's an error. That's a good thing. I congratulate you. But if you did that and suddenly we assigned null and a warning showed up, your build would break, your compile would break, and you'd probably have thousands and thousands of warnings of existing code that has been running in production. And it turns out you have to explicitly turn on this nullability feature. So when I said by default, your null reference types are not nullable unless you decorate them with the question mark, it's actually not default unless you tell the compiler that, hey, you want to opt into this feature. So it's by default if you've opted in, but if you haven't opted in, then it's not by default. And since I'm in Visual Studio 2019, you'd think there's some nice dialogue. I would just sort of right-click on the properties of my project, and I could just go specify, hey, nullability should be turned on. And it turns out there's actually no UI element for turning on nullability. The C# team is one team at Microsoft, and the Visual Studio team is another team at Microsoft. And the C# team was working very hard at making sure this nullability thing was working well, and it's just the way you want to work. And the Visual Studio team was adding a whole bunch of features, and they didn't sort of connect about, hey, there's this fundamental C# 8 feature. And so you have to go make some changes on your own. Without a UI. The obvious one is to do a pound nullable and enable, and you can do that, and then everything below that line is going to be enabled for if you go do that. But since this talk is not about C# 8, you would actually go into the CS proj file, and fortunately to go in the CS proj file, it's not a big operation. You just double click on the project and it opens up the CS proj file. I know this seems extremely trivial, and I'm going to do this so many times because you're like, why didn't it do that since Visual Studio 2001, right? 2003. Why did we not have, well, we didn't. And now it's just there. So you double click, you can open up your project, and then you can go ahead and you can add your nullability features. So I can go and say nullable here. And you can enable. And then you get that, and when I save that, and I go back to my program, unless I misspelt it, which I didn't mean to. It's going to give me another warning. It's saying, hey, you've turned on nullable, but you didn't specify which version of C# you'd like to be using. Value for enable. So you can go and actually specify the language version in here, and you can go and specify lang version 8.0, and then go back. And both of those settings you have to go do without, that's not what I meant to do, without UI support and sort of help you do that. Now it turns out that nullable feature one, it actually depends on which framework you're using. So if you go and specify here, you got Net Standard 2.0, Net Standard, wow, 2.1. Then you automatically are able to start doing C# 8 stuff, and you don't need this line here. Net Standard. Fortunately, I'm pair programming, and you guys are actually helpful. This is good. So you don't need to actually specify, but nullable, no matter what, you have to opt into. So you have to go specify for nullable that's a feature you want to go ahead and turn on and have available to you. Okay, I'm going to keep going. You'll notice now there's now a squiggle underneath here, and I can do a control period, and it's now going to warn me, hey, if you're going to go and assign null to a non-nullable data reference type, because there's no question mark in front of it, then you should probably consider changing it to go put a question mark in. And you'll notice it then props up with the preview feature of sort of what that is. For those of you who didn't see me, I did control period. So it's well and familiar with everyone. Control period is the keyboard shortcut to get that IntelliSense. Pops up and says, hey, declare null as nullable. But you'll notice there's something really interesting about this. Right here, I get to specify whether I want to make the change right here on this line. I just hit enter. Or I can actually choose to fix the same problem in the entire document, or the entire project, or the entire solution. So if you've got tons and tons of code, you could, and I want to emphasize this, you could decide to change all of your code willy-nilly to be question mark. Now, just to repeat yes, this would be a great, the advice from the audience here, is this would be a great thing to do on a Friday afternoon, just as you're about to leave on vacation for a couple of weeks. This would be sure that you'll be quite popular during the time that you're gone. Or at least people would think about you lots, so that's for sure. So what's interesting about the choice, and I want to be careful here, it consistently gives you the choice to make this change. And we can work through the implications. Let's look at another one that's here. I've gone ahead and done we've got one here. That's not the one I was looking for. Let's see here. You'll notice here, there's one that is simply correcting the formatting. And you could make a choice, right? This is very minor. It's just going to go ahead and remove the space. And you could go, hey, that seems reasonable. I'd like to go make that change for my entire project. Let's go ahead and apply that. So it's not that they don't apply. It's that there is the possibility of doing it over the case. And sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. But be aware, presumably you're running source code control. And if you decide to do this over your entire solution, your solution's just a mere 343.9 projects, it might have an effect on a lot of files that you might want to be, consider what the impact might be. Just hypothetically speaking. You'll notice that as this happens, I am actually getting warnings here. Some of these things pop out as sort of, hey, these are IDE advice, and they're just going to show up in the IDE. They're not actually going to show up in the command line. If I go to the command line and do a .NET build, the IDE warnings aren't going to appear there. They're just going to appear here as CS warnings themselves. A couple others to be aware of. Some of the larger things you could do here. So you can go to an if statement here, and I can do a dot operator. And I can actually go convert the if to invert it. So I can actually go ask the opposite, and I can invert the if statement fairly quickly. That's an interesting way to go. I could have converted to a switch, because maybe that's more appropriate. So these are fairly complex operations that you might want to go ahead and do in terms of your changing your code or refactoring out your code. You can do things like go to your base classes. This was available in earlier versions of Visual Studio, like Visual Studio 2010 used to allow you to sort of refactor methods out, refactor methods out into base classes, and that now is possible inside Visual Studio 2. You can go extract method outs into base classes and things